Okay, we're on.
All right. So, Gavin and I are back to discuss the final three chapters from Dawkins's book, Climbing Mount Improbable. That's chapters 8, 9, and 10. Um, a couple of comments Gavin and I wanted to make, or just to touch base. So for this week, we are now in week 4 already. So we are, after today, we'll be more than halfway through the course. Week 4, we're asking you to please view 4 parts of the PBS Evolution series. And that's parts 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I think you will find that much of the material overlaps with, but doesn't replicate what we're reading in Dawkins's book. So the first, in part 2, called Great Transformations, this deals with sort of major changes, major evolutionary transformations or changes over evolutionary history. So from the water onto the land. And so it's incredibly broad-based sort of issues, but you'll hear a lot about a lot of different kinds of animals. Part 3 is on extinction, and there you'll see that extinction and natural selection really do go hand in hand, as Darwin himself discussed in his book on the origin of species. Part 4 is evolutionary arms races, or evolutionary arms race. There you will get a very broad introduction with lots of examples of coevolutionary arms races. So between predator and prey, or between parasite and host. And again, I think it's another way to get a good feel for what we're talking about when we talk about selection pressures and adaptations, how they incrementally sort of are produced over vast periods of evolutionary time. And then finally, part 5 addresses the issue of why sexual reproduction evolved, what it evolved to solve, and then the variety of sort of issues that sort of are brought on board when you deal with sexual reproduction, such as mate selection, competition, and related topics. And so this week then will conclude our discussion of sort of very basic evolutionary science sorts of principles and ideas and concepts. And then beginning next week, we'll begin applying them explicitly to the topic of human virtue and violence. And this is, we'll begin next week discussing the first few chapters from The Goodness Paradox, which is written by an evolutionary anthropologist, primatologist called Richard Wrangham. It's a really, really wonderful book. The subtitle is The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. And so I think, Gavin and I were just talking about this. I think this book, the next book we read, will almost certainly feel much easier for you as students to get through. It's not that Dawkins isn't a good writer. I think he's an excellent writer, but I think it was, he's dealing with some pretty, pretty heady sorts of topics. Beyond evolution by natural selection, you get into a lot of different concepts and ideas in Climbing Mount Improbable. What we'll be doing in The Goodness Paradox is really applying some of those basic evolutionary ideas. And I think Wrangham does a particularly good job of, sort of guiding the otherwise guiding readers who may not have any kind of a background in evolution. So you as students will actually have a leg up. And we hope that much of what you read won't surprise you. It should sound familiar, although he may use different examples. But we'll get there when we get there. Anything else, Gavin, that we want to add?
No, I think that about does it.
Okay, well, our plan for today is probably to talk for about an hour from this point, an hour and perhaps a few more minutes. So let's begin with chapter 8, which is pollen grains and magic bullets. And so in thinking about this, I just went back and sort of reviewed once again, so sort of this chapter and the next 2 chapters and what Dawkins is getting at from sort of the broadest dimension. And I really think that a lot of what he's getting at here is summarized in the final paragraph. Although he doesn't say it in so many words, I think that's what we're seeing here. So if you jump to page 274, excuse me, he's sort of summarizing a lot of what he's talked about in this chapter, but let me just take a moment to direct your attention to that final paragraph on page 274 and 275, the final paragraph of this chapter. So Dawkins writes, elephant bodies cannot tell whether they are working to spread elephant DNA or virus DNA. Okay? And bees' wings cannot tell whether they are working to spread bee DNA or flower DNA. As it happens, if we set aside exceptional cases, like the bees that are fooled into wasting their time copulating with bee orchids, they are working to spread both. The difference between own DNA and pollen DNA, from the point of view of the bee's executive machinery, cannot be perceived. Peacocks and bees, flowers and elephants stand to their own DNA in much the same relation as they stand to the DNA of parasitic viruses that infest them. Virus DNA is a program that says, duplicate me in a simple and direct way, using the ready-made machinery of host cells. Elephant DNA, in contrast, says, duplicate me in a more complicated and roundabout way that involves first building an elephant. Flower DNA says, duplicate me in an even more complicated and roundabout way. First, build a flower, and second, use that flower to manipulate by indirect influences such as seductive nectar the wings of a bee, which has already conveniently been built to the specifications of another lot of DNA, the bee's own DNA, to carry far and wide the pollen grains inside, which are the very same DNA instructions. We shall approach this conclusion again from a different direction or another direction in the next chapter. So he's saying a lot in that last paragraph and pulling together many of the different examples he takes you through, the reader through. Ultimately, I think part of what he wants to do here is make it very clear that the animals that we study in animal behavior, whether they are bees or elephants or humans, are temporary vehicles for the genes that built them. It's at the level of the gene that natural selection works. And in some sense, that can be stated very simply. And as Dawkins mentions, things can get fairly complicated fairly quickly, but not so complicated that we can't understand it. In terms of elephants, I sort of liked his example that, an elephant is, a very roundabout way for elephant genes to lever themselves into the next generation. I mean, they copy themselves by virtue of, or, with the sort of intermediate step of building an elephant, that then behaves in such a way as to make it more likely that the genes that built it are copied. So that's a fairly direct, way for genes to lever themselves into future generations. Slightly less direct, and sometimes head-spinningly less direct. You get situations of flowers, for example. Genes that build flowers, building flowers in such a way that they manipulate bees, to visit them, to pick up pollen. That is essentially the sexual cells of the flower, to then take it to the next flower. All of this is sort of detail built on top of the basic premise that the gene is the unit of selection, that humans and elephants and flowers are temporary vehicles for the genes that built them. It's the genes that are passed on. It's the genes that replicate, not individuals. Individuals, live a lifetime, but then are cast aside. What would you like to add?
Yeah, I feel like there is just a lot in this these last 3 chapters, and I think it helps that it ties back to a lot of the same sort of stuff he says in other books. Like the selfish gene is a very different way, or a somewhat different way, I think, of him, Dawkins, getting at the same sort of concept. But I feel like one of the important sort of takeaways from these last 3 chapters, if anything, is, Dawkins is sort of saying, like, no matter how complicated the relationship or the behavior of a single plant or animal gets, or how complicated the relationship between something like a flower and a bee, or a fig and a wasp gets, the individual genes responsible for these, different adaptations are working only in service of themselves. Even if the
Right.
behavior of the bee that results in its own, survival and reproduction happens to also help the flower, you wouldn't say, and you shouldn't say that the behavior in the bee or the genes responsible for that behavior are helping the flower. They didn't evolve to help the flower.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's a nice, that's really, I mean, there are many places where he sort of hammers that point home, but I think one of the first places, at least in this chapter, I don't know, that doesn't seem quite right because it seems like it's almost near the end. But I think a really nice summary of some of those ideas on page 268. So this is in the paragraph where it begins. Let's see. I think I want to back up. On 267, he says, we began by lampooning the common fallacy that flowers and animals are placed in the world for the benefit of humans. Cattle, docilely eager to be eaten, and so on. Marginally more defensive was the idea that they are placed in the world for the benefit of others with whom they have a naturally evolved mutualism. Flowers for the benefit of bees, bees for the benefit of flowers, acacia bullhorns for the benefit of ants, and their ants for the benefit of acacias. But this notion of creatures being for the good of other creatures is in peril of reductio ad absurdum. We must have no truck with the pop ecologist's fallacy. That is, we shouldn't put any weight in the pop ecologist fallacy, the holistic grail of all individuals striving for the good of the community, the ecosystem, or Gaia. It is time to get fussy, says Dawkins, and sharpen up what we mean whenever we talk of a living creature being there, quote, for the benefit of anything. What does for the benefit of really mean? What are flowers and bees, wasps and figs, elephants and bristlecone pines? What are all living things really for? What kind of entity is it whose benefit will be served by a living body or a part of a living body? The answer is DNA, genes. Living bodies and all the parts that make up living bodies are there because the genes that built them succeeded in getting passed on from previous generations.
Right, right.
And he essentially he's hammering home that super basic idea throughout this chapter.
Mm-hmm. And he continues talking about what viruses are for, and then that's,
Right.
I guess, where he sets up the computer analogy. But even without talking about that, the virus one is a good one because it's, I think, clearer to see how a self-replicating code that builds viruses and exists by virtue of its ability, like its skill, if you wanna say that, at replicating itself, finding new hosts, finding like new material with which to replicate itself and inject its DNA. And that's if it can be said to be for anything, that's it.
Yeah, and that's actually makes it extremely clear that there's no purpose here. I mean, think about that. Viruses are doing nothing. I mean, the genes that build viruses are getting themselves copied by commandeering, the cellular machinery and the copying machinery of hosts, right?
Right.
So what is the purpose of that? The purpose is simply for the genes to get themselves copied. Why would they do that? Because that's what genes do. I mean, there's no sort of grander meaning or more complicated message. Genes, are in the business of replicating themselves. Not because they want to, not because they have to, but because they do. And that is simply what genes do.
Right, right, and they don't follow any like preordained sort of trajectory, or they don't want to go in certain directions. As Dawkins has made that point, I think pretty clear throughout many places in this whole book. Although I don't think he's ever really said it this way. It's sort of like they just happen along whatever path is most readily available and most viable for the goal of replicating themselves, such that some genes end up being written as instructions for making an elephant, and other genes end up being instructions that create viruses. So
Right. Yeah, actually, there's another paragraph that I think is really good. He says, this is on page 270, "It is tempting to expostulate about the pointlessness of such parasitic programs, as I did when talking about disease viruses." So here he's talking about computer viruses. But anyway, he says, "What on earth is a useful program that says nothing but duplicate this program?" Right? Admittedly, it will be duplicated, but isn't there something ridiculously odious about such purely self-referential efforts? Of course there is, he says. It is viciously futile. But it doesn't matter that it is futile and pointless in that sense. It can be utterly pointless and still spread. It spreads because it spreads because it spreads. Right? The fact that it does nothing useful on the way, and may even do something harmful on the way, is neither here nor there. In the world of computers and disk swapping, it survives simply because it survives. So that's in the context of computer programs. And then he goes on to say biological viruses are just the same. Fundamentally, a virus is just a program written in DNA language, which is very much like a computer language, even to the point of being written in a digital code. Like a computer virus, the biological virus simply says, copy me and spread me around. Okay? As in the case of computer viruses, we aren't suggesting that the DNA in a virus wants to get itself copied. It's just that of all ways in which DNA could be arranged, only the arrangements that spell out the instructions spread me, spread. The world willy-nilly becomes full of such programs. Right? Once again, like the computer viruses, they're here because they're here because they're here. If they didn't embody instructions to ensure that they exist, they would not exist. So, I mean, that's actually, I mean, it's easy to read and it's easy to get the words, string them all together in a sentence. But it is it's a kind of a slippery idea. I mean, genes aren't for anything other than getting themselves copied.
right,
And even there, they don't want to. That's just what they do.
yeah,
The same is true with viruses. So let's push forward and look at chapter 9, where he talks about the robot repeater. Now this one, okay. So let's just look at how he begins this. He says, "We have just concluded that flowers and elephants are in effect hosts to their own DNA, in the same kind of way as they are hosts to virus DNA." So far, so good. This is correct, but it leaves difficult questions unanswered. There is an important step missing from the argument. Computer viruses have an easy time of it because the world is already full of computers, powerful, ready, and waiting to obey instructions. But these computers are man-made. They are handed to the parasitic programs on a plate. DNA viruses, too, have their hosts, with all their elaborate instruction-obeying cellular machinery handed to them on a plate. But in the case of living machinery, where does the machinery come from? Then he says, I might as well finish this paragraph here. He says, "Imagine something like a computer virus, which instead of having a ready-made computer all set up to obey its instructions, had to start from scratch. It couldn't just say, duplicate me, because there's no computer there to obey the instructions, right? To be truly self-spreading in a world without ready providing computing and duplicating machinery, what would a self-duplicating computer program have to do? It would have to begin by saying, quote, make the machinery needed to duplicate me. And before that, it would have to say, make the parts with which to assemble the machinery to duplicate me. And before that, it would have to say, gather the raw materials necessary to make the parts. This more elaborate program needs a name. Let's call it the TRIP, the Total Replication of Instructions Program. So all Dawkins is doing here is he's asking us, to push our thinking back and ask, how does the self-replicating machinery get there? How does this process get going, right? We've established that once it is going, well, genes, behave so as to make copies of themselves, sometimes through roundabout, digressions such as an elephant, or a tiger or a human. But now he's saying we've actually jumped ahead too quickly. He's saying we also need to think about where does this complex machinery come from that takes and replicates genes, or that genes use to replicate themselves, is a better way of saying it.
Right. And is he talking about like sort of the origin of the ability of genetic material to replicate itself, or is he just talking about reproduction in general? Because I know he goes into like the robot metaphor throughout this chapter, but I feel thrown off by those first couple paragraphs about what exactly it is he's trying to explain here, like in this chapter.
He's trying to explain, so what he has said so far is, we know that living organisms, behave in the service of the genes that built them, right?
Mm.
But of course, genes themselves are replicated by virtue of very complex DNA replication machinery. So he's saying, wait a second, we skipped a step. That machinery, how did that machinery get there? Wouldn't you need some means of, you'd need to have some, well, no, the machinery is there, and it's actually quite complicated. And he's saying that what you actually need is an explanation for the machinery, for the existence of, or the evolution of the machinery that actually, that DNA, that genes use to lever themselves into future generations.
Okay, all right.
In short, you're right. What he's really getting at, and I don't even know if he talks about this quite so explicitly, but is the evolution of, basically the first self-replicators. You have to get self-replicators before you can have self-replication.
Right.
And so, it's, he's asking us, the reader, to take a deep breath and realize that you can't just, poof into existence, replicating machinery. Replicating machinery is actually very complex as we know it. So DNA replication machinery, for example, or RNA replication machinery. So part of what he's asking us to appreciate is that we skipped ahead a little bit. And so he's using this TRIP, this total replication of instructions program, to sort of grab a hold of this problem that we sort of skipped over. How did this machinery that replicates DNA, how did that get there?
Okay. Yeah. And I guess that does sort of help me, because there are a lot of individual points that I understand why he didn't, try to cram them into this chapter.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of individual aspects of that machinery that you could spend a lot of time talking about, like the RNA and the role of gametes and sexual reproduction, and then how, once an egg is fertilized in vitro, at least in, animals, how that fetus starts to develop by the doubling of cells, which I think he does talk about in here.
Yes. Yeah.
But he also kind of spends some time talking about other sort of aspects of replication, like when he talks about the size of the Trojan horse later, which
right.
I think is sort of in service of explaining that for much of biological life, most things were extremely small, which I think he was getting at or he was trying to explain like the limitations of this replicating technology.
Sure.
And why life has been so small for so long.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's exactly what he's doing. And just to sort of spend a little bit of time, just a little bit more time anyways, on this total replication of instructions program, okay, he takes you through some of the issues with the sort of hypothetical robot, right, that he's talking about. And he goes on, this is on page 281. He says, okay, so the hypothetical robot that we have now worked towards can be called a trip robot. So a trip robot, such as we are now imagining, is a machine of great technical ingenuity and complexity. The principle was discussed by the celebrated mathematician John von Neumann. Let's go blah, 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 skipping the parenthetical stuff. But no von Neumann machine, no self-duplicating trip robot has yet been built. Perhaps it never will be built. Perhaps it is beyond the bounds of practical feasibility. But then he quickly says, well, what am I talking about? What nonsense to say that a self-duplicating robot has never been built. What on earth do I think that I myself am? Or you, or a bee, or a flower, or a kangaroo? What are all of us if not trip robots? Okay, total replication of instructions program robots. We are not man-made for the purpose. We've been put together by the processes of embryonic development under the ultimate direction of naturally selected genes. But what we actually do is exactly what the hypothetical trip robot is defined as doing. We roam the world looking for the raw materials needed to assemble the parts needed to maintain ourselves and eventually assemble another robot capable of the same feats. Those raw materials are molecules, which we mine from the rich seam of food. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah. No, that paragraph I think helps me at least sort of frame this chapter.
And then, so I think this is actually, I won't continue right here, but just direct students' attention to this section right here. He notes that some people find it offensive to be called a robot. Blah, 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 blah. Moving forward, he says a robot is any mechanism of unspecified complexity and intelligence which is set up in advance to work towards fulfilling a particular task. The trip robot's task, okay, is to distribute copies of its own program about the country, together with machinery necessary to execute the program. Okay, so he continues on. This is on page 282. He reminds the reader that the starting point of our discussion of self-copying robots was this. We decided that a simple duplicate me program, a computer virus, or a real DNA virus was all very well, but it depended upon the world being very cushy, set up with machinery capable of reading and obeying instructions. But the world is cushy like that only because somebody or something else has already built the instruction-obeying machinery. We've now imagined a highly sophisticated robot, which is, once again, a gigantic digression on a duplicate me program. Instead of just saying duplicate me, the program says, assemble the parts and make a new version of the entire machinery needed to copy me, and then load me into its onboard computer. So he says, we've arrived back at the conclusion of the previous chapter. An elephant is a huge digression within a computer program written in DNA language. An ostrich is another kind of digression. An oak tree is another. And of course, a human is another. We are all trip robots, all von Neumann machines. Then he says, okay, but how did the whole process start? Right, and that's where he gets into the variety of, various theories. He didn't spend too much time on it, but I mean, this remains an active area. It's a field of biology known as abiogenesis, so the origin of self-replicating molecules. And there are theories that rely on, sort of clay structures or crystalline structures, or sort of rudimentary RNA that then evolves into DNA machinery. So no one has the answer. And indeed, we don't know if it's happened more than once. We know it has to have happened at least once because we're here, right? But there are people who make an argument that it's likely happened millions and millions of times. We just haven't bumped into these other self-replicating machines, these other trick robots. So the next few pages, he's talking about the origin of life or the origin of self-replicating molecules. And he sort of brings it to a close on page 285, or at least maybe not close, but I really like this paragraph, and I want to draw students and everyone's attention to it. On page 285, he says, "An origin of life anywhere consists of the chance arising of a self-replicating entity." Okay, nowadays, the replicator that matters on Earth is the DNA molecule, but the original replicator probably was not DNA, in part because DNA itself is incredibly complicated.
Right.
And you can't just poof complicated stuff into existence. Everything has to start simple. He says we don't know what it was. Unlike DNA, the original replicating molecules cannot have relied upon complicated machinery to duplicate them, although in some sense they must have been equivalent to duplicate me instructions. The language in which the instructions were written was not a highly formalized language, such that only a complicated machine could obey them. The original replicator cannot have needed elaborate decoding, as DNA instructions and computer viruses do today. Self-duplication was an inherent property of the entity's structure, just as, say, hardness is an inherent property of a diamond, something that does not have to be decoded and obeyed. That speaks to my reference to clay structure or crystalline structures, where you automatically get self-replication. Then finally, he ends this paragraph by saying, and I've sort of highlighted it, he says, "We can be sure that the original replicators, unlike their later successors, the DNA molecules, did not have complicated decoding and instruction-obeying machinery, because complicated machinery is the kind of thing that arises in the world only after many generations of evolution. And evolution does not get started until there are replicators." Okay? In the teeth of the so-called catch-22 of the origin of life, the original self-duplicating entities must have been by the spontaneous accidents of chemistry. And that is a good entryway into this field of abiogenesis. You know, what are these sort of original replicators?
Right. And I think so. This chapter to me feels like Dawkins. I think, although again he doesn't say it explicitly, it feels like him trying to be fair to anyone who might be skeptical reading, in that he is applying the same scrutiny to the origin of life, abiogenesis, as he has to animal behavior and different animal adaptations throughout the rest
Sure.
of the book, talking about the very simple first gradual steps that would have needed to happen in order for life to begin. So that's sort of what this chapter feels like to me, now that we're talking about it, and now that you've pointed out those specific areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's my take on it as well.
Okay.
Each chapter, as you mentioned, is loaded with all kinds of information. But again, I think what we are doing is trying to sort of bring to the front, what are the major sorts of ideas or concepts or issues that Dawkins is raising that students in this class ought to be aware of and to understand. And again, it's not about being utterly convinced, but it's about being it's about appreciating and understanding the arguments and the ideas that Dawkins is communicating. Okay, so tap into notes. On page 297, towards the end of this chapter, he does point out that far from nanotechnology being really new and alien, in fact, it's old. So that's top page 297. It is we big things that are new, alien, strange. We are products of a flashing new, that is only a few 100 million years, gigatechnology, giga from the point of view of our genes. And he says, fundamentally, life is based in the nano world of the very small, nano from our point of view, a world of protein molecules made to the coded specifications of DNA molecules and controlling the interactions of other molecules. So then he says nanotechnology is for the future, from our perspective, right? Nanotechnology is for the future.
Right.
Let's return, and this is where I want to point out, this is Dawkins's take on what he is attempting to communicate here. He says, let us return to the main message of this chapter and the previous one. The genes of an elephant or a human, like the genes of a virus, can be seen as duplicate me computer programs. virus genes are coded instructions that say, if they happen to be parasitizing an elephant cells duplicate me. Elephant genes say, elephant cells work together to make a new elephant, which must be programmed in its turn to grow and make more elephants, all programmed to duplicate me. The principle is the same. It is just that some duplicate me programs are more indirect and long-winded than others. Only parasitic programs can afford to be short-winded, right? Because they use ready-made machinery to obey their instructions. Elephant genes are not so much non-parasitic programs as mutually parasitic subroutines. An elephant's genes are like a gigantic colony of mutually supported viruses. Each elephant gene plays a part that is no larger than the role played by a virus gene. Each one plays its own small part in the cooperative building of the machinery that they all need for their program execution. Each one flourishes in the presence of the others. Virus genes also flourish in the presence of the set of cooperating elephant genes, but they do not contribute anything positive in return. If they did, we should probably not call them virus genes, but elephant genes. And to put it another way, every body contains social and antisocial genes. The antisocial ones we call virus genes and other kinds of parasite genes. The social ones we call elephant or human, kangaroo, sycamore, etc. genes. But the genes themselves, whether social or antisocial, whether virus genes or own genes, are all just DNA instructions. And they all say in one way or another, by fair means or foul, briefly or long-windedly, duplicate me. So I think that's a nice way of sort of bringing a lot of those first two chapters together.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just to be clear, when he's talking about antisocial versus social genes, he is just talking about, antisocial being viruses that are working for their own benefit, which is at odds with the interests of the elephant genes, and the social ones are, the elephant's own DNA or the elephant's own genes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay.
Cooperative versus, you could think of social would be like cooperative, and antisocial would be uncooperative. Okay? I mean, generally speaking, the genes that build an elephant have shared bodies across, sometimes millions of years, with the same genes that they share, or that they share the current body with. And so there's a long evolutionary history of cooperation among the genes that work together to build an elephant. That's not to say that there aren't instances of antisocial sort of behavior where genes sort of opt out or bail out. And that can happen. And that creates problems for the organism, as you can imagine. But viruses, so as a first approximation, are not cooperative. They don't have any interest in cooperating. The virus genes that exist today are those that were replicated, regardless of any negative consequences they may have had for the individual. So long as those negative consequences were no more costly than might have been the case with any other set of virus genes.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. That's a good way to help conceptualize it.
Okay, so the last chapter he calls A Garden Enclosed, and this, he really applies a lot of what he's written about in the first 9 chapters to, an extraordinarily complicated sort of co-evolved system of adaptations, right? Between fig trees and fig wasps, basically.
Right, yeah.
And I certainly, I don't think, Gavin and I are interested in you remembering all these details, because I can't for the life of me. I have to read it very carefully and not sleepy, as he moves through these different examples. And so if that was true for you, for you guys, well then, I'll have to speak for Gavin, then you're in good company, if you consider Gavin and I good company. This is a tough slog. It is, yes, the details, I'm sure somebody remembers them. I don't remember the details. But the bigger picture is we know quite a lot about the coevolution and the coevolutionary processes that built fig wasps and the figs that harbor them. And it is a sort of wonderfully complicated, unbelievably complex, you know, set of interrelationships. And I think Dawkins is, you know, basically using this example to sort of illustrate many of the concepts that he's written about and introduced in the first 9 chapters. Does that seem like a fair sort of broad assessment?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder, do we want, so I'm just debating on how much do we want to say
So
particular issues. Yeah.
I did want to talk a little bit about the last example that he
Mhm.
brings up, the one that he says is the most complicated. If only because I think that by virtue of it being the most complicated, it is also sort of the best example of a lot of the stuff he's trying to explain.
Yes.
And also like the key point, which is that, like I said earlier, no matter how complicated the relationship gets, and no matter how much it may not seem like it, animals, individual organisms, and really individual genes within those organisms are only acting in their own self-interest, not for the
That's right.
interest of, other genes, other organisms, and especially not other species, although it may seem for all the world like that is the case, like the fig wasp that he talks about in the last example. I can't remember what the name of the species is, but it's the one where the female tree and the male tree are different from one another.
Right. Right.
So one tree, and do you want me to sort of give a rundown? Because I think that might also help if we
Sure.
try and
Yeah.
explain.
Yeah. Definitely.
So one tree produces only male fruit, and the other tree produces only female fruit. And the fig wasp, as Dawkins talks about throughout the rest of this chapter, can only reproduce inside a fig. And that's true for all of the different fig species and all of their accompanying wasp species. But also, for many species, when the fig wasp reproduces in the fig, it's also helping transport fig genes around so that they can mate with or fertilize one another. But what's peculiar about this species that he talks about is that, or what's different from this species from the others, is that the female tree, which produces all female figs, is useless to the fig wasp in terms of reproducing. So they only want to crawl inside the figs of males. And of course, once they crawl inside, their wings are usually torn off and they don't exit again. So
Right.
once they enter one fig, that's it, they're done. So, from the perspective of the fig, what they want is to get inside the figs of a male fig tree and reproduce inside the male fig. But from the perspective of the fig tree, it wants figs to spread its genes around to trees of the opposite sex.
Right.
So, how does it do this? The male tree in this species has fake female fruits or replica females,
Yeah. Or he calls them pseudo female flowers.
pseudo female flowers.
Yeah.
And these function to basically, what is it, look like males on the outside to get the.
Or pseudo female flowers. So to look like females, right? Female flowers.
See, yeah, this is where it gets complicated. I knew they were pseudo
Right.
females, but I thought they were supposed to look like males in order to get the wasp to. Oh no, actually, what it is the point of the female or the pseudo female flowers is to select for
Right.
select for females, female fig wasps, so female bugs, that get tricked into entering the female flower and reproducing there, and then having her babies, and then the babies go out, and then they, by falling for that same trick, they then go into real female
Right.
fig fruits or fig flowers, where their genes, like that's where that lineage dies. From the perspective of the wasp, that's game over for that individual. But then it allows the fig tree to reproduce because the genes of the male fig tree have then been transported to the female fig tree.
Right.
And so what the male is doing is that it's, I think one sort of way to help think about it is these male fig trees are basically doing the service of resupplying each new generation of fig trees and fig wasps with a sort of faulty detection mental adaptation or behavior, whatever you want to call it. They're sort of providing each new generation with female wasps that mistakenly go into female fig flowers because that's the only way the fig tree can reproduce. But the wasp is also sort of stuck in this relationship because they need to reproduce in this fig tree,
Right.
in this specific fig tree, and so they keep running the risk of going into a pseudo female on a male tree. Does that sort of
Yeah,
summarize it?
no, absolutely. And and the other thing to keep in mind is that there's always some risk of getting ripped off, like one side ripping off the other one.
Mm.
There are various ways in which, wasps can check, not obviously not consciously and not individual wasps, but over evolutionary time, there are ways in which each side keeps the other side honest. That is, ensures that the other side is holding up their side of the bargain. Yeah, no, I think you've highlighted the key complications. Now, with that in mind, let me draw the students' attention to at the end of this chapter. So this is on page 325. So with all that complicated stuff in mind about this co-evolutionary arms race and these conflicts that are going on between fig wasps and figs, he says, figs and fig wasps occupy the high ground of evolutionary achievement, a spectacular pinnacle of Mount Improbable. Okay? Their relationship is almost ludicrously tortuous and subtle. It cries out for interpretation in the language of deliberate, conscious, Machiavellian calculation. Okay? Yet it is achieved in the complete absence of any kind of deliberation, without brain power or intelligence of any kind. The point is rubbed home for us by the very fact that the players are a tiny wasp with a very tiny brain on the one hand, and a tree with no brain at all on the other. Okay? It is all the product of an unconscious Darwinian fine-tuning, whose intricate perfection we should not believe if it were not before our eyes. It's so ridiculous. There is a form of calculation going on, or rather millions of parallel calculations of costs and benefits. The calculations are of a complexity to tax our largest computers. Yet the computer that is performing them is not made of electronic components, not even made of neural components. It is not located in a particular place in space at all. It is an automatic distributed computer whose data bits are stored in DNA code, spread over millions of individual bodies, shuttling from body to body via the processes of reproduction. It's kind of cool. I mean, that example really does bring home that this is evolutionary natural selection is simply a process that happens. Anytime you have individual differences in a population, some of which are heritable and some of which cause the individuals displaying those traits to be more likely to survive and reproduce, you will get evolution by natural selection. and nobody is guiding it, nobody is trying to do it. There is nobody there. Although it does feel like that. I mean, especially when you look at, the sort of the dance, over evolutionary time that's going on between wasps and their figs. I mean, it's each party has, is sort of stunningly evolved to deal with the other party as if they're thinking through these things. But there's no thinking through. I mean, that's patently obvious when you look at the fig tree. There's no brain to think.
Well, yeah, not only that, but I also think, and I think it bears repeating because I have seen some students in the comments sort of talk about, and it's a common sort of thing that people ask about like foresight, basically. Why?
Right.
I think some of the best evidence for the sort of completely non-thinking and in many ways brainless nature of natural selection is that it has absolutely no foresight. It is, sort of climbing blindly up Mount Improbable by whichever path it is able to stumble up first. And that's how you get these sort of relationships like between the fig and the fig wasp. Or I don't know if we've talked about cuckoos in this class, but I think they're another good example of, two species sort of relying on each other, or one species relying on another in such a way that, if the host or if one member of the mutualistic partnership were eliminated, that would spell the end for its partner as well.
That's right. I don't think he did. No, not in this book. I don't think he talked about cuckoos. But yeah, I mean, that's another good example of a, tortuously, sort of subtle, multifaceted, series of relationships between species that have co-evolved adaptations, to solve problems posed by the other party.
Right.
All right, so towards the end of this chapter, then he kind of brings it all back around to Mount Improbable. So he says, so I think I might back up just a tiny bit. The second to the last paragraph, he says, it was the rise of nervous systems and brains that brought designed objects into the world. Designed, not designoid. Nervous systems themselves, and all designoid objects, are the products of an older and slower cosmic dance. This particular researcher, Sherrington's vision helped him to become one of the leading investigators of the nervous system in the first part of the century. We may profit by borrowing a parallel vision. Evolution, Dawkins writes, is an enchanted loom of shuttling DNA codes whose evanescent patterns, as they dance their partners through geological beat time, weave a massive database of ancestral wisdom, a digitally coded description of ancestral worlds and what it took to survive in them. And then he says, but that is a train of thought that must wait for another book. The main lesson of this book is that the evolutionary high ground cannot be approached hastily. Even the most difficult problems, such as, what is going on between the figs and the fig wasps, even the most difficult problems can be solved, and even the most precipitous heights can be scaled, if only a slow, gradual, step-by-step pathway can be found. Mount Improbable cannot be assaulted. Gradually, if not always slowly, it must be climbed. So he's brought it all sort of back to his key metaphor of Mount Improbable.
Right, and the designoid objects he tied back in.
All right. Well, is there anything else we want to highlight from these last couple of chapters here, Gavin?
I can't think of anything else. I feel like we've, like you've said a couple times, getting the larger points, like the larger message across. I feel like these last 3 chapters themselves do that pretty well, and then I feel like we've done as best we could to illuminate those for students. So,
yeah, I agree. And also, again, let me just make another plea for students to, view the assigned videos for this week That's from the PBS Evolution series, parts 2 through 5. It will help. It will help you understand this material because you're hearing it in a slightly different context. Many of the examples are different, but they overlap. And so I think it's really important to try to come at these issues from several different directions. Okay, the text, clearly doing the reading of the book is crucial. Watching these videos gives you another opportunity to hear, some highlights, from each of these chapters. But then also watching the videos that we've assigned or the lectures. I can't emphasize it enough. I know that students regularly report that it was incredibly valuable to watch these videos. And that's true not just for the Evolution PBS series, but for the Growing Up in the Universe series that we started with. So the first couple of weeks, we asked you to view the Growing Up in the Universe series, a 5-part series that Dawkins narrated and produced for public television. And as we've discussed, this book, in fact, is an outcome. It's a modified sort of variation on those 5 lectures that we began the class with. So, how else to say it but that if you didn't watch them yet, you have plenty of time to do so and go back and watch them. It is worth your time to see those 5 videos, then see the 3-part Genius of Charles Darwin series, and then finally the PBS Evolution series, at least parts 2 through 5. Okay?
Yeah, sounds good. And of course, I agree. The videos are super helpful, so please do watch those.
There are sections, that are less interesting, I suppose. That's always going to be the case. But on balance, it is easily worth the cost of, a few hours of time to watch those videos. And, really, Gavin and I aren't interested in making busy work. We have found these videos to be super useful in the past. As I've mentioned before, I've taught animal behavior, almost every semester for the last 20 years, I think, something like that. And, these are the kinds of videos that I've assigned many times, in part because they're consistently found to be useful. There are others that you don't see that were found less useful. They were selected out.
Right.
Okay, well, enough of that. Very good. So that'll do it then for this week. And next week we will begin Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox.
All right. Sounds good.